The warning lights painted Outpost Kethera in shades of red and amber, as Station Administrator Telris ran through the curved corridors toward the command center. Her four-fingered hands trembling as she pulled herself along the handrails with practiced speed that came from 30 years of service aboard this remote station. The Velnar people had built Outpost Kethera as a gift to the galaxy, a neutral ground where any species could meet, trade, and share knowledge without fear of territorial disputes or political tensions. And for 2 generations, it had stood as a beacon of peace in the outer reaches of the Sagittarius Arm, where few dared to venture. Telris burst into the command center, where her staff huddled around flickering displays that showed a nightmare made real. 7 massive vessels surrounded the station, their hulls decorated with the jagged symbols of the Crowhawk's Marauders, a confederation of pirates and raiders who had terrorized the outer systems for decades. Shields at 40%, her second officer Velm reported, his usual calm voice cracking with fear as another impact shook the station and sent loose equipment clattering across the floor. Telris gripped the edge of her command console and forced herself to think clearly despite the ice water flooding her veins, because 3,000 souls depended on her now. Velnar families, visiting traders from a dozen species, scientists conducting research in the peaceful isolation this station provided, and 200 children attending the intercultural school they had established just 5 years ago. "Send distress signals on all frequencies," she ordered, as the lights flickered again, and somewhere deep in the station, a hull breach alarm began its terrible wailing. Velm worked the communications array with desperate speed, broadcasting their emergency across every known channel, while the tactical display showed the Croc ships methodically hammering down their defenses with weapons that outclassed anything the peaceful Velnar had ever needed or wanted. The Velnar had no warships because they had no enemies. They built gardens and libraries and music halls. They welcomed strangers with open arms and believed that kindness would be returned in kind. And now that philosophy was being tested in fire and violence. "I'm getting responses," Velm said, and for one brilliant moment, hope flared in Telris's chest until she saw his face fall as he read the incoming messages. The Torvin Collective sent regrets. Their fleet was engaged in territorial disputes and could not spare ships for a rescue mission in such a remote location, especially not against the Crocs, who were known for their savagery and superior numbers. The Zelthari Empire responded with cold calculations. The strategic value of Outpost Kethera did not justify the risk of engaging a full Crocs raiding party, and they suggested the Velnar consider surrender to minimize casualties. The Drazen Federation sent sympathies, but explained their nearest battle group was 3 weeks away at maximum speed, and they could not authorize such an extended deployment for a station that was not under their direct protection. Message after message arrived with the same crushing theme. Regrets, calculations, apologies, but no help coming. "Shields at 25%, Velm reported as another barrage struck the station, and Telris felt the deck shudder beneath her feet with a grinding sound that spoke of structural damage somewhere in the outer ring. The Croc's commander's face appeared on every screen in the command center, a scarred and brutal visage with eyes that held nothing but contempt as he broadcast his terms in the harsh, guttural language of the Marauder clans. "Velnar Station, your shields are failing, and no one is coming to save you," the Croc's commander said, with a smile that showed too many teeth filed to points in the beans. Traditional warrior style of his people. "We will board in 1 hour and take everything of value, your trade goods, your technology, your ships, and anyone we can sell in the slave markets of the contested zones. Though I doubt soft creatures like you will fetch much price." The transmission cut off and left the command center in stunned silence, broken only by the steady ping of the tactical sensors tracking the circling Croc's vessels, like predators waiting for wounded prey to stop struggling. Telris looked around at her crew. people she had worked with for years, friends who had celebrated festivals together and shared meals and raised their children in the safety of this station that now felt like a trap closing around them. "Keep broadcasting," she said quietly, because giving up was not in her nature, even when logic said all was lost. "Someone might hear us. Someone might care enough to try." Velm nodded and bent back to his console, while Telris authorized the emergency protocols that would seal the civilians in the reinforced core sections and distribute what few defensive weapons they possessed among volunteers who had never fired a shot in anger. The hours crept past with agonizing slowness as the shields continued to fail and more responses came in from distant civilizations, all offering condolences and explanations for why they could not help, carefully worded to sound sympathetic, while making it clear that the Velnar were on their own. "Shields at 10%, Velm reported, and Telris could hear the defeat in his voice, because they both knew what came next. The Crocs would breach the hull, storm through the corridors with weapons that could cut through bulkheads, and take everything while the galaxy watched from a safe distance, and later would express their sorrow at the tragedy that no one could have prevented. Telris began composing a final message to her daughter, studying on the Velnar homeworld, trying to find words that would carry love and courage across the light years, when a new signal pinged on the communications array. Velm looked up, with confusion on his face as he routed the signal to the main speakers, and a voice came through, speaking accented but clear Galactic Standard, with an earnestness that cut through the despair like sunlight through storm clouds. "Outpost Kithara, this is Captain Maria Santos of the Terran vessel Thunderhead," the voice said, and Telris felt something she had not felt in hours, a spark of hope struggling to life. "We received your distress call, and we are coming. Hold on just a little longer, because help is on the way." Telris stared at the speaker as if she could see through it to the source of that promise, while her mind raced through what little she knew of humans, a young species who had joined the galactic community only 15 years ago, considered reckless and emotional by the older civilizations, living on the far edges of explored space. "They're 4 hours away at maximum speed," Velm said after checking the signal origin, then added with crushing honesty, "Our shields will fail in 30 minutes. But Telris was already responding to the human captain with words that came from somewhere deeper than logic or calculation, from a place that still believed in kindness and courage, even when the universe seemed determined to prove such things were foolish luxuries. "Captain Santos, we are grateful beyond words," Telris said, as another impact shook the station and alarms wailed in the background. "But the Crocs have 7 warships, and they will breach our hull before you can arrive." The response came back immediately, with a confidence that seemed absurd, given the mathematics of distance and time and firepower. "Then we'll just have to be faster than possible and hit harder than expected," Captain Santos said, and Telris could hear the smile in her voice alongside something else. Determination. That sounded like thunder rolling across distant hills. "Humanity doesn't leave people behind. We're coming for you, and the Crocs are about to learn what happens when they threaten our friends." The transmission ended, and Telris stood in the red-lit command center, surrounded by her frightened crew, while somewhere in the dark between stars, a ship called Thunderhead burned toward them at speeds that would terrify any sane engineer. She did not know if these humans could arrive in time, or if they stood any chance against the Crocs armada. But for the first time since the attack began, Telris felt something other than despair. Someone was coming. Someone had answered when the galaxy turned away. Captain Maria Santos watched the tactical display aboard the Thunderhead as her ship hurtled through space at speeds that made her chief engineer send increasingly alarmed reports about reactor temperatures and structural stress tolerances that they were cheerfully ignoring. She had pushed the emergency override codes 15 minutes ago and locked out the safety protocols that would have prevented the ship from accelerating past recommended limits, because there were people dying 4 light hours away, and Maria had learned long ago that sometimes the only sane response to an insane situation was to do the impossible. "I'm reading fluctuations in the port nacelle," Chief Engineer Rodriguez reported from the engine room, where he and his team were literally holding equipment together with emergency welds and prayers. "We can't maintain this speed for more than 3 hours without risking a cascade failure." "Then we'd better get there in 2.5, Maria replied, with a calm she had perfected over 12 years of commanding vessels in situations that the Academy textbooks said were unwinnable. The distress call from Outpost Kethera had reached Earth's outer monitoring stations 16 hours ago, and had been routed through the usual bureaucratic channels, while administrators debated response protocols and calculated risk versus reward. But Maria had been close enough to receive the broadcast directly, and she had made her decision in the 5 seconds it took her heart to remember what it felt like to be helpless and alone. She had been 8 years old when pirates had attacked the colony on Titan's moon Enceladus, where her parents ran a small hydroponics facility. And she still remembered hiding in the cold storage units, while gunfire echoed through the corridors, and her mother's voice called out one last time before falling silent. The colony militia had fought back with mining equipment and improvised weapons. Farmers and scientists facing professional killers, and by the time Earth's nearest patrol ship arrived 3 days later, there were graves to dig and orphans to comfort. And Maria had learned that sometimes help comes too late to matter. She had joined the Earth Defense Force at 16, with forged documents, and a burning need to make sure no other child would hide in the dark, wondering if anyone cared enough to come. And now, 20 years later, she commanded a light cruiser on the fringes of human space, where the new and the desperate went seeking fortune or fleeing failure. "Captain, I'm picking up responses from other ships," Communications Officer Chen reported, his young face lighting up with excitement as signals pinged across the display. "The cargo hauler Prosperity is altering course to join us, and the colony transport New Dawn just broke orbit from the Kepler station." Maria felt pride swell in her chest, because this was humanity at its finest. Politicians who calculated acceptable losses, or the corporations who measured everything in profit margins. But the ordinary people who heard someone calling for help and dropped everything to answer. "Open a channel to all responding vessels," Maria ordered, as she pulled up the tactical situation around Outpost Kethera, and felt her jaw tighten at the sight of 7 Crocs warships circling their prey like sharks scenting blood. The human ships appearing on her display were a mismatched collection that would make any proper admiral weep. Cargo vessels designed for hauling freight, research ships meant for studying cosmic phenomena, even a passenger transport that should be nowhere near a combat zone. But each one was crewed by humans who had made the same choice she had. "This is Captain Santos to all ships responding to the Kethera distress call," Maria said into the communications array that would carry her voice across the void to her impromptu fleet. "We don't have superior weapons or numbers. We don't have authorization from Earth Command. And we definitely don't have any guarantee of survival. But 3,000 innocent people are about to die if we don't do something crazy." She paused and looked around her bridge, where her crew worked with focused intensity. People she had trained and fought beside and trusted with her life 100 times over, in situations that should have killed them, but somehow never did. "The Crocs think no one will challenge them, because they're big and mean and have more guns," Maria continued, with a fierce grin spreading across her face. "So let's show these pirates what happens when they underestimate humans, who are too stubborn to know when they're supposed to give up." The responses came back in a chorus of voices from different ships and different backgrounds, but all carrying the same message: acknowledgement of the insanity they were about to attempt. Anyway, Captain Zhang of the Prosperity suggested using his cargo drones as improvised missile platforms. Dr. Okoye from the research vessel Curiosity offered to deploy her sensor jamming equipment to confuse enemy targeting. And Commander Williams aboard New Dawn volunteered his ship's massive cargo bay as a field hospital, despite having zero combat medical supplies. Maria coordinated the chaos into something resembling a plan, while Thunderhead continued its impossible acceleration toward a station that was probably already being boarded by Croc's raiders, who thought they had won. She remembered her briefing on the Crocs from the xenology reports, a confederation of various species who had rejected galactic civilization and turned to piracy, known for their brutality and their tendency to sell captives in the illegal slave markets that operated in the lawless zones between recognized territories. The report said engaging Croc's forces was inadvisable unless you had overwhelming firepower and a willingness to fight to the death, because they gave no quarter and expected none. But Maria had read a lot of reports over the years that said things were impossible right before she proved them wrong. Coming up on optimal weapons range in 90 minutes, her tactical officer Lieutenant Kim reported while studying the enemy formation with the practiced eye of someone who had survived 3 border skirmishes and a pirate ambush in the asteroid belt. They're not even trying to hide, just sitting there like they own the place. Because they think they do, Maria said quietly as memories flooded back, hiding in the cold while her parents died, watching Earth patrol ships arrive too late, swearing on her mother's grave that she would never let distance or difficulty keep her from helping someone who needed it. She had been court-martialed twice for disobeying orders to pursue fleeing raiders, reprimanded 5 times for unauthorized rescue missions, and decorated for valor 4 times when her gambles paid off and saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. The admirals called her reckless, and her crew called her fearless, but Maria knew the truth. She was terrified every single time she pushed her ship past its limits and charged into situations where the smart money said she would die. But fear was just another obstacle to overcome, like distance, or weapons, or numbers. "All ships, this is Santos," she broadcast as the mismatched human fleet converged on Outpost Kethera, where the Velnar were making their last stand against an enemy that outnumbered and outgunned them. "We're going to hit them fast and hard before they know what's happening. Use everything you've got, and don't give them time to organize a response." The plan was barely worthy of the name. Arrive at maximum speed, scatter the Croc's formation with whatever weapons and improvised tactics they could manage. Civilians, while fighting a running battle against superior forces, and somehow survive long enough to retreat before the Crocs recovered and destroyed them all. It was the kind of plan that got people killed and ended careers, and violated so many regulations that Maria had stopped counting. But it was also the kind of plan that saved lives, when everyone else had given up and turned away. "Approaching weapons range," Kim reported, as Thunderhead and her unlikely companions dropped out of their acceleration burn and began final approach vectors that would bring them screaming into the Croc's formation like avenging angels. Maria stood and gripped the command rail as adrenaline surged through her system, and her heart pounded with the familiar rhythm of combat approaching. Fear and excitement and determination all mixed together into the peculiar cocktail that had kept her alive through 2 decades of impossible situations. She opened the communications channel to Outpost Kethara, where Administrator Telris was probably watching her sensors in disbelief as a handful of human ships charged towards 7 Croc's warships with all the caution of a meteor entering atmosphere. "Outpost Kethara, this is Captain Santos," Maria said with absolute confidence ringing in her voice, because doubt would kill them faster than enemy weapons. "Humanity has arrived, and we're coming in hot. Get your people to the core sections, and be ready to evacuate when we breach the Croc's perimeter." The response came back weak and crackling with interference from weapons fire that was probably tearing through the station's failing shields. But Maria heard the hope in Telris's voice alongside the fear. "Captain Santos, there are 7 warships, and you have only 5 vessels," the Velnar administrator said with the kind of polite concern that suggested she thought humans were either heroes or fools, and had not yet decided which. Maria laughed, made her crew grin, because they knew that laugh meant their captain was about to do something that would either be brilliant or get them all killed, or possibly both. Administrator Telris, you're about to learn something important about humans, Maria said, as Thunderhead crossed into weapons range, and her tactical displays lit up with target locks and firing solutions. We don't fight fair, we don't follow rules, and we absolutely refuse to let good people die while we sit safe and comfortable somewhere else. Now hold on, because things are about to get interesting. She cut the transmission and turned to her crew with fire in her eyes and steel in her voice. All weapons free, maximum aggression, show them what lightning looks like. The Crowhawk's commander Vexthor watched his tactical display with bored satisfaction as the Velnar station's shields flickered toward complete failure, already planning how to divide the plunder among his 7 ships, and which captives would fetch the highest prices in the slave markets. His weapon crews were making bets on how quickly the soft Velnar would surrender once boarding parties breached their hull, and Vexthor was considering whether to allow his warriors the traditional victory celebration, or maintain enough discipline to maximize the cargo they could extract before other pirate clans arrived to claim a share. The sensor alarm that interrupted his pleasant calculations seemed like a malfunction at first. 5 small contacts, approaching at speeds that his technical officer insisted were impossible for vessels of those masses and configurations. Identify those ships, Vexthor ordered, with annoyance creeping into his voice, because interruptions were unwelcome. When he was this close to claiming his prize, "Unknown configuration, Commander," his sensor operator reported while frantically cycling through the database of known galactic vessels. "They're not responding to hails, and they're not slowing down despite being well within our weapons range." Vexthor pulled up the visual feeds and saw a collection of ships that looked like random civilian craft, a light cruiser, 2 cargo haulers, a research vessel, and what appeared to be a passenger transport, all bearing the simple blue and green emblem of Earth's unified government. "Humans," Vexthor said with contempt dripping from his voice, because he had heard stories of this young species from other raider captains. "The impulsive fools who think emotion is a substitute for strategic thinking. Destroy them and return to the primary objective." His weapons officer began targeting solutions, but the human ships were moving in erratic patterns that violated every principle of even. Proper fleet formation, weaving and crossing each other's paths, in a chaos that made precision targeting difficult. The cargo vessel Prosperity released a cloud of objects that Vexthor's sensors initially read as cargo containers until they suddenly activated maneuvering thrusters and drove toward his lead ship like missiles guided by some insane programming. "Evasive maneuvers," Vexthor ordered, as he realized the humans had weaponized their loading drones, strapping simple explosives to equipment designed for moving freight and turning them into improvised weapons that his point defense system struggled to track. The human research ship Curiosity began broadcasting electromagnetic interference that scrambled his tactical displays and made his weapon locks flicker and fail, while the cruiser Thunderhead came screaming through the gap in his formation with its forward guns blazing. Vexthor's flagship took hits along the port side as Thunderhead passed close, enough that he could see the human captain standing on her bridge through the viewports, a woman with fierce eyes, who looked at his warship like it was just another obstacle to overcome. "Return fire," Vexthor roared, as anger replaced his contempt, because these humans were not fighting like proper warriors, but like desperate animals, using every dirty trick they could imagine. The battle devolved into chaos that offended Vexthor's sense of order, as the human ships refused to maintain formation or follow any predictable pattern, instead flowing around his larger vessels like water finding cracks in stone. Captain Santos aboard Thunderhead coordinated the madness with a precision that belied its apparent randomness, sending quick commands that had cargo drones exploding against shield generators, while Curiosity's jamming created windows where human weapons can strike without being countered. The passenger transport New Dawn launched its shuttle fleet. Evacuate, but to swarm around Croc's warships like angry insects, using their small size and maneuverability to draw point defense fire away from the larger human vessels. Vexthor watched his carefully organized assault on Outpost Kethera fall apart as he was forced to divert ships to deal with the human attack, and his rage grew with each passing moment that these inferior forces continued to survive his superior firepower. Board them, Vexthor ordered, because Croc's warriors were trained for close combat, and he would crush these impudent humans in the corridors of their own ships, where their tricks could not save them. His boarding pods launched toward Thunderhead, but Santos had anticipated the move and vented atmosphere from her port side, creating a directional blast that pushed her ship into a wild spin that sent most of the boarding pods tumbling past their target. The few pods that managed to attach found themselves facing human crew members who fought with a creativity that Croc's warriors had never encountered, using maintenance tools as weapons, venting compartments to create zones of zero gravity where humans seemed more comfortable than the invaders, setting up ambushes in areas they knew intimately. Aboard Outpost Kethera, Administrator Telris watched the impossible battle unfold on her sensors, while her second officer Velm kept repeating that the humans were going to die, and there was nothing they could do to help. But Maria Santos had other plans, and she broadcast them directly to the Velnar station, as Thunderhead made another attack run that brought it close enough to fire docking clamps. Telris, we're creating an opening in the Croc's formation, Santos said, while alarms wailed on her bridge and damage reports scrolled across displays showing systems failing throughout her ship. Get your people ready to evacuate through our docking port. We'll hold them off as long as we can. Taking heavy damage, Telris replied with horror in her voice, because she could see Thunderhead's shields fluctuating and hull breaches opening along its flanks. You should retreat while you still can. Retreating was never part of the plan, Santos said, and Telris heard her laugh, a sound of pure defiant joy that seemed insane in the middle of a battle that by all logic the humans had already lost. Besides, we're just getting warmed up. The human engineer Chen, who had been coordinating damage control, suddenly appeared on the external hull, wearing nothing but an emergency vac suit and carrying a plasma cutter, moving with magnetic boots toward Outpost Kethara's shield generator that had been damaged by Croc's weapons. What is he doing? Telris whispered as she watched the young human work in the open space between ships, where weapons fire and debris created a death zone that no sane person would enter. Shen reached the generator and began cutting through the damaged sections with steady hands despite the chaos erupting around him, working to restore power to systems that would stabilize the station's failing defenses. A Croc's weapons burst caught him in the shoulder and spun him around, but Chen grabbed a support strut and pulled himself back to the generator, continuing his work even as his suit's medical systems pumped emergency sealant into the breach. Someone get him back inside, Telris cried out, but her own people were scrambling to prepare for evacuation, and none of them had the training to attempt a rescue in the middle of a space battle. Aboard Thunderhead, Lieutenant Kim saw what Chen was doing and made a decision that would probably get her killed. She launched herself out the airlock with a rescue tether and began pulling herself hand over hand toward the damaged generator where Chen worked. The two humans met on the outside of Outpost Kethara and together completed the repairs while Thunderhead, Prosperity, Curiosity, and New Dawn fought to keep the Croc's ships distracted and confused. Chen's final connection restored power to the shield generator, and Telris watched her displays light up with renewed defensive fields that would buy them precious time. But the young human engineer had used the last of his strength, and was drifting away from the hull with his suit's thruster fuel exhausted. Kim grabbed him and triggered her return tether just as a Crocs fighter made a strafing run that would have vaporized them both. But Captain Zhang aboard Prosperity had been watching, and he positioned his cargo ship directly in the line of fire. The weapons burst tore through Prosperity's unarmored hull and scattered cargo containers into space. But Kim and Chen made it back to Cathara's airlock alive, while Zhang reported casualties and system failures that would make his ship useless for anything except a very expensive debris field. "All human vessels, this is Santos," the captain's voice came across the tactical network with strain evident in her tone, because Thunderhead had taken damage that would require months in a repair dock to fix properly. "We've got the station stabilized. Begin evacuation protocols and prepare to cover our retreat." But Vexthor had seen enough, and his rage at being humiliated by these primitive humans overwhelmed his greed for plunder. He ordered all ships to concentrate fire on Thunderhead, because destroying the human commander would restore his honor. 7 Crocs warships turned their weapons on the damaged cruiser and began a bombardment that no ship of Thunderhead's class could withstand. And Maria Santos knew that her luck and her ship's structural integrity were both running out. She looked at her crew, people who had followed her into hell a dozen times and somehow always made it back. And she made the hardest decision a captain could make. "All hands abandon ship," Santos ordered, as explosions ripped through her beloved Thunderhead and systems failed in cascading waves. "Get to the escape pods and rendezvous with New Dawn. That's an order." Her crew hesitated because leaving their captain was not something humans did easily. But Santos's voice carried absolute authority when she repeated the command, and they began evacuating while she remained at the helm to buy them time. Telris watched in horror as Thunderhead's crew escaped while their captain stayed behind to fight alone, and she understood something fundamental about humans in that moment. They would sacrifice everything to save others, even when logic said the cost was too high. Santos set Thunderhead on a collision course with Vextor's flagship and locked the controls before heading to her own escape pod. But she paused at the airlock and broadcast one final message to the Crocs commander. "This is Captain Maria Santos to the Crocs fleet," she said with absolute steel in her voice. "You came here expecting an easy target and no resistance, but you forgot something important. There are people in this galaxy who believe that protecting the innocent matters more than calculating acceptable risks, and humanity will always be among them." She triggered the pod just as Thunderhead slammed into Vexthor's flagship in a collision that lit up the tactical displays like a newborn star. And the Crocs commander's ship began tumbling out of control, with massive damage to its command structure and primary systems. The remaining Crocs vessels saw their leader's ship crippled, and the station's defenses restored, and the human ships still fighting despite impossible damage. And they made the calculation that raiders always made when prey proved more costly than expected. The medical bay aboard New Dawn had been converted from a passenger lounge 8 hours ago, and now overflowed with wounded from all 3 species. Humans who had fought beyond exhaustion, Velnar civilians who had survived the siege, and even 2 Crocs warriors who had been captured during the boarding actions and were being treated despite their crimes. Captain Maria Santos sat on a makeshift bed with her left arm in a regeneration sleeve, and burns across her shoulders from the plasma fire that had caught her escape pod during the evacuation, watching Dr. Okoye move between patients with the calm efficiency of someone who had learned medicine in war zones. The destruction of Thunderhead felt like losing a piece of her soul, but Maria forced herself to focus on the fact that her crew had survived, and 3,000 Velnar civilians were alive, because a handful of humans had decided that doing the right thing mattered more than following safe and sensible protocols. Administrator Telris approached with hesitant steps as if she feared disturbing Maria's thoughts, her four-fingered hands carrying a tray with something that smelled vaguely like tea mixed with cinnamon. "Captain Santos," Telris said in the soft melodic voice that characterized Velnar's speech patterns, "I brought you some kava from our stores. It is traditional among my people to offer hospitality to those who have shown us great kindness." Maria accepted the cup and took a careful sip of the warm liquid that tasted both familiar and alien at the same time. And she saw Telris studying her face with an expression that combined gratitude and confusion. "Why did you come?" Telris asked finally, with raw honesty in her voice. "Your government did not order this mission. You had no treaty obligation to our people. You risked your lives and lost your beautiful ship for strangers you had never met. I do not understand what could drive someone to make such a—" Maria looked down at the kava and remembered her mother making hot chocolate on cold Enceladus nights, while her father sang old Earth songs in Spanish. And she remembered hiding in the freezer while those same parents died trying to protect their neighbors from pirates who saw compassion as weakness. "Because you asked for help," Maria said simply as she met Telris's eyes and saw the administrator struggling to comprehend such a straightforward answer. "Because no one should face darkness alone, and because the galaxy needs to remember that some things matter more than profit calculations or risk assessments." Telris sat down beside her, with tears running down her face in the slow, deliberate way that Velnar physiology produced emotional responses. And Maria put her good arm around the alien administrator while she wept. The news of the battle had already spread across the galactic communication networks with a speed that surprised even the humans who were used to information traveling fast in connected civilizations, and responses began arriving from species who had ignored the original distress call. The Torvin Collective sent formal apologies and offers of compensation for their failure to respond. The Zelfari Empire dispatched a diplomatic mission to Outpost Cathara with vague references to renegotiating their strategic assessments, and the Drazan Federation announced they were implementing new rapid response protocols to prevent similar situations in the future. But the most meaningful responses came from ordinary beings across a dozen species who sent messages of support and gratitude that flooded the station's communication systems with so much traffic that Velm had to set up filters just to manage the incoming data. Maria watched recordings that showed Velnar children drawing pictures of human ships fighting monsters in space, and she saw interviews with survivors who spoke about the moment hope had arrived. They thought all was lost. Engineer Chen recovered in the bed next to hers, with his shoulder rebuilt by Velnar medical technology that was surprisingly advanced, despite their lack of military applications. And Lieutenant Kim visited him every few hours with updates on the crew and shy smiles that suggested their shared near-death experience had created bonds deeper than professional respect. "Captain, you should see this," Communications Officer Rodriguez said, as he brought a datapad showing a broadcast from the Galactic News Network, where various species were debating the implications of humanity's rescue mission. The debate featured representatives from the older civilizations who had established galactic society millions of years before humans left Earth's surface, and their opinions ranged from admiration to concern about this new species that seemed determined to involve itself in situations that careful analysis said were unwinnable. "Admirable courage, but questionable wisdom," a Zelthari diplomat said in the careful, measured tones that characterized their species. "Strategic resource allocation requires accepting that not every situation can be resolved favorably, and throwing away assets on low-probability rescue missions sets a dangerous precedent." But then Administrator Telris appeared on the screen, speaking with a passion that Maria had never heard from the gentle administrator, and her words carried across the galaxy with the weight of someone who had looked death in the face and been saved by strangers. "The Zelthari speak of strategic calculations and acceptable losses," Telris said, as her image looked directly into the camera with fierce intensity. But I ask you to imagine being on the other side of those calculations. Imagine being the one whose life is deemed not worth the risk, whose children are acceptable casualties in someone else's cost-benefit analysis. She paused, and Maria could see her trembling with emotion that she was channeling into articulate arguments that challenged the foundation of galactic diplomatic thought. Humanity came when no one else would, Telris continued, with her voice rising in volume and conviction. They risked everything for people they had never met, because their culture values compassion over caution, because they believe that doing the right thing matters more than doing the safe thing. And I submit to this council that perhaps we older civilizations have forgotten something important in our millions of years of careful strategic thinking. The Velnar administrator looked around at the assembled representatives from dozens of species and delivered her final statement with absolute certainty. Perhaps we have forgotten that kindness is not weakness, that compassion is not foolishness, and that sometimes the most strategic choice is simply to be the kind of civilization that shows up when others are not suffering. The broadcast ended, and Maria felt pride swelling in her chest, because Telris had articulated something that humans often struggled to explain: the conviction that some actions were worth taking regardless of the mathematical probability of success. Over the following days, Outpost Kethera transformed from a disaster zone into a hub of activity as ships arrived from across the galaxy, bringing supplies and volunteers and representatives who wanted to help rebuild what the Crocs had damaged. The Velnar government sent engineering teams and materials, but they also sent something more precious: a declaration that Outpost Kethera would be renamed the Kethera Santos Friendship Station in honor of the human captain who had sacrificed her ship to save their people. Human vessels began arriving as well, as Earth Command scrambled to respond to the unauthorized mission that had somehow become a diplomatic triumph, and Admiral Chen, no relation to the engineer, came aboard New Dawn with a disrespect that suggested he could not decide whether to court-martial Maria or give her a medal. "Captain Santos," the Admiral said as he found her in the medical bay, where she was helping coordinate repair efforts despite her injuries. "You violated direct orders by engaging in combat without authorization. You exceeded your command authority by organizing an impromptu fleet. You pushed your ship past safety limits and ultimately destroyed a valuable military asset. And you created a diplomatic incident by involving Earth in what was technically an internal matter between the Velnar and the Crocs marauders." Maria stood at attention despite her injuries, and prepared herself for whatever consequences Earth Command had decided to impose, because she had known the risks when she made her choice, and she would accept them without complaint. However, Admiral Chen continued with a slight smile breaking through his stern expression, "You also saved 3,000 civilian lives, established humanity as a force for good in galactic affairs, inspired changes in rapid response protocols across multiple civilizations, and demonstrated that our species' reputation for courage and compassion is well-deserved." He pulled out a small case and opened it to reveal the Earth Defense Force's Medal of Valor, the highest honor that could be awarded to someone who risked their life to save others. "On behalf of Earth Command and the grateful people of our world, I present you with this recognition of your extraordinary service," Admiral Chen said, as he pinned the medal to her medical gown since her uniform had been destroyed along with her ship. "Though I am also required to inform you that you are being reassigned to diplomatic duties because clearly letting you command warships results in far too much excitement." The medical bay erupted in laughter and applause from the wounded crew and Velnar civilians who had gathered to watch the ceremony, and Maria felt tears on her face as she realized that sometimes breaking the rules and trusting your heart led to outcomes better than any careful plan could achieve. That night, the station held a memorial service for the 5 humans and 17 Velnar who had died in the battle, and Maria stood with Telris as they honored the fallen under the vast viewing windows that showed the stars burning in endless configurations. "Your people gave their lives for mine," Telris said quietly, as they watched the small capsules containing the deceased drift away toward the system's sun in the traditional Velnar funeral rite. "How can we ever repay such a debt?" "You already have," Maria replied, as she gestured toward the children playing in the rebuilt recreation area, where human and Velnar youngsters were learning each other's games and languages. "You're teaching the galaxy that some things are worth fighting for, and you're making sure that our friends didn't die in vain." The Velnar administrator took Maria's hand in her four-fingered grasp, and they stood together in silence, while outside the station, human ships and Velnar vessels worked side by side to repair the damage and build something stronger from the ruins of what the Crocs had tried to destroy. And somewhere in the deep dark between stars, the Crocs raiders limped home with stories about the crazy species called humans, who fought like lightning and refused to abandon those in need. The galaxy was learning a new lesson. Humanity had arrived. 6 standard months after the Battle of Cathara, the galaxy looked different in ways both subtle and profound, as the ripple effects of humanity's rescue mission spread through civilizations that had operated by the same careful calculations for millions of years. The Cathara Santos Friendship Station had been rebuilt with contributions from 43 different species, who sent materials and expertise and apologies for their initial failure to respond, transforming the damaged outpost into a gleaming symbol of what cooperation could achieve when compassion overcame caution. Administrator Telris stood in the new command center that combined Velnar architectural grace with human practical design, watching ships from across the galaxy dock at the expanded facility that now served not just as a trading post, but as a model for what interspecies collaboration could accomplish. The station had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, as beings came to see where a handful of humans had fought against impossible odds and won through determination rather than superior firepower. And Telris found herself giving tours to delegations who wanted to understand how such a transformation had occurred. But the most significant changes were happening far beyond the station's walls, as civilizations reconsidered their response protocols and strategic doctrines in light of what humans had demonstrated. The Torvin Collective had established rapid response fleets positioned at strategic points throughout their territory, with explicit orders to prioritize distress calls over territorial concerns, and their fleet commander had publicly stated that the shame of failing Cathara would never be repeated. The Zelfari Empire had begun training what they called humanitarian intervention forces, designed to respond to crises without requiring weeks of bureaucratic approval, though their implementation still involved enough forms and procedures to make human observers shake their heads in bemused frustration. Even the cautious Drazen Federation had adopted new protocols that allowed local commanders to authorize emergency assistance without waiting for central government approval, acknowledging that sometimes speed mattered more than perfect coordination. The real change, however, was happening in the hearts and minds of ordinary beings across the galaxy who had watched the battle recordings and heard the survivor testimonies and decided that humanity's example was worth following. A young Torvin named Kexval had organized a volunteer rescue service that patrolled the outer systems, looking for ships in distress, explicitly citing Captain Santos as inspiration for dedicating his life to helping strangers. A Zelthari scientist named Dr. Zenthar had abandoned a prestigious research position to join the Galactic Medical Corps after watching Chen work to repair Cathara's shields while wounded. With the same selfless dedication, stories like these multiplied across known space as humanity's reputation shifted from reckless newcomers to brave allies who could be counted on when things got difficult. But not everyone celebrated the changes, as the Galactic Council convened on the neutral world of Centrum to debate what some called the Cathara Protocols, and others called humanity's dangerous influence on established order. The council chamber held representatives from 200 civilizations who had built galactic society through careful negotiation and strategic patience, and many of them viewed humanity's emotional approach to crisis response as a threat to the stability they had maintained for eons. Ambassador Krathos of the Zelthari spoke first with the measured calm that his species had perfected over 5 million years of civilization. The human action at Cathara was admirable in its intention, but dangerous in its implications, while holographic displays showed tactical analyses of the battle. They succeeded through luck and improvisation against an enemy that was unprepared for their unconventional tactics. But such success cannot be replicated consistently. She gestured toward data showing casualty rates and resource expenditures that proved humans had won at terrible cost. If we encourage all species to respond emotionally to every distress call, we will create chaos and deplete our defensive capabilities, chasing situations that cannot be resolved favorably. Krathos continued, with logic that had guided Zelthari policy for longer than humans had existed as a species. Strategic restraint exists for good reasons. Several other representatives voiced agreement, with variations on the theme that humanity's courage was commendable, but their example should not become standard practice for civilizations that valued stability and long-term planning. Then Administrator Telris rose to speak, and the chamber fell silent, because the Velnar rarely participated in Galactic Council debates, preferring to focus on cultural exchange and peaceful cooperation rather than political maneuvering. Honored representatives, Telris began, with her soft voice carrying clearly through the translation systems. I come before you not as a politician or strategist, but as someone who lived through the situation you are discussing with such detached analysis. She activated her own holographic display, showing not tactical data, but the faces of Velnar families who had sheltered in Cathara's core sections, while Croc's raiders hammered their shields toward failure. When we sent our distress call, we received many responses, Telris said, as her display showed the messages of regret and calculation that had arrived from the assembled civilizations. You explained your strategic concerns, your resource limitations, your careful analysis of acceptable risks, and every one of your explanations was logical and reasonable, and would have resulted in our deaths. The chamber stirred uncomfortably as Telris's words cut through the diplomatic language that usually insulated council members from the human consequences of their decisions. The humans did not send explanations or apologies, she continued with passion building in her voice. They sent ships and warriors who fought for us despite having no strategic interest in our survival, no treaty obligation to render assistance, and no guarantee that their sacrifice would succeed. Telris looked around at the assembled representatives with tears on her face, but steel in her voice. You speak of humanity's emotional approach as if it were a weakness to be corrected, but I submit that your millions of years of strategic thinking have made you forget something essential, she said, while her display showed Chen working on the shields while wounded, and Kim pulling him to safety, and Sentos steering her ship into a collision that saved thousands. You have forgotten that civilizations are not built on calculations alone, but on the willingness of individuals to sacrifice for others, even when the odds say they should not. Ambassador Krathos began to respond, but Telris raised her hand in a gesture that commanded attention, despite her species' reputation for gentle passivity. My people built Outpost Cathara as a gift to the galaxy, because we believed that kindness and hospitality created bonds stronger than treaties or trade agreements, Telris said with absolute conviction. The older civilizations accepted our gift, but when we needed help, you calculated that we were not worth saving, while the youngest species in the council came without hesitation because they believed that doing the right thing mattered more than doing the safe thing. She paused and let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for those who preferred hiding behind diplomatic. So I ask you to consider, which approach has created more value for galactic civilization? Telris concluded with quiet intensity. Your millions of years of careful strategic restraint, or humanity's 15 years of impulsive compassion that inspired 43 species to rebuild our station and dozens more to establish rapid response protocols that will save countless lives in crises to come. The council chamber erupted in debate that lasted for 7 hours as representatives argued about protocols and procedures and philosophical questions about the balance between strategic thinking and moral action. When the vote came, it was closer than expected, but the resolution passed, establishing what became known as the Kethara Protocols that encouraged all member civilizations to maintain rapid response capabilities and prioritize humanitarian assistance, even in situations where strategic analysis suggested restraint. The protocols were not mandatory because the Galactic Council rarely enforced anything, but they created a framework that allowed the compassionate impulse to overcome bureaucratic hesitation in future crises. Captain Maria Santos learned about the vote while reviewing blueprints for the new diplomatic vessel she would command. A ship designed for crisis negotiation and humanitarian missions rather than combat, though her chief engineer had quietly ensured it could fight if necessary. Admiral Chen had kept his promise about reassigning her away from pure military duties, but had also ensured that her new posting would allow her to continue making the kind of difference that had inspired a galaxy. "Captain, you have a visitor," her aide announced, and Maria looked up to see a young Velnar woman wearing the uniform of the newly established Galactic Rapid Response Service. "Captain Santos, my name is Valaris, and I am the daughter of Administrator Telris," the young Velnar said with formal precision that barely concealed her nervousness. "I have been accepted for training with Earth's Defense Force Academy, and my mother suggested I speak with you about what to expect." Maria smiled and gestured for Valaris to sit, while she considered how to explain to this idealistic youngster that service meant sacrifice, and that doing the right thing often came at terrible cost. But then she remembered her own training and the teachers who had inspired her, and the moment she had decided that protecting others mattered more than protecting herself. "The Academy will teach you tactics and strategy," Maria said while looking at Valaris with the same fierce determination that had driven her to charge 7 Crocs warships with 5 civilian vessels. "But the most important lesson is one they cannot put in a textbook. Sometimes the difference between tragedy and triumph is simply refusing to accept that good people should suffer alone." Valaris nodded with understanding in her eyes, suggested she already knew this truth from watching her mother nearly die while the galaxy calculated acceptable losses. Over the following years, the changes continued, as humanity's examples spread through galactic civilization like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. New species joined the Rapid Response Service and trained alongside humans, who taught them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. The Kethara Santos Friendship Station became a training facility where young beings from across the galaxy learned not just tactics and emergency response, but the philosophy that some things mattered more than strategic calculations. Captain Santos commanded her diplomatic vessel through a dozen crises where her willingness to arrive first and ask questions later saved lives and prevented tragedies that careful analysis said were inevitable. And on the rebuilt station, Administrator Telris maintained a memorial wall. The names of those who had died in the battle. 5 humans and 17 Velnar, who had proven that sacrifice for others was the highest form of service. The wall included a quote from Captain Santos that had become famous across the galaxy. "We don't leave people behind." Those 5 words had changed how civilizations thought about their obligations to strangers, and their willingness to risk safety for the sake of others who needed help. The Krohax Marauders still raided in the outer systems, but they gave wide berth to any station or ship that displayed Earth's blue and green emblem. And their warning to new raiders was simple: never attack when humans might respond, because those crazy beings fought like lightning and refused to accept defeat. 10 years after the Battle of Cathara, a young human child named Santos, no relation, learned about the rescue mission in school, and asked her teacher why Captain Santos had risked everything for strangers. Teacher smiled and explained what humanity had always known, but the galaxy was still learning: that the measure of a civilization was not its military power or economic strength, but its willingness to show up when others needed help. Because in the end, the greatest strategic advantage was simply being the kind of people that others could count on when the darkness came and hope seemed lost. Humanity had struck like lightning, and the galaxy had learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon was compassion backed by the courage to act. And that was a lesson worth more than all the strategic calculations in the universe.